Chapters 83 and 84 of The Way of All Flesh. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. The Way of All Flesh by Samuel Butler. Chapter 83. Joey and Charlotte were in the room. Joey was now ordained, and was curate to Theobald. He and Ernest had never been sympathetic, and Ernest saw at a glance that there was no chance of a rapprochement between them. He was a little startled at seeing Joey dressed as a clergyman, and looking so like what he had looked himself a few years earlier, for there was a good deal of family likeness between the pair. But Joey's face was cold, and it was illumined with no spark of bohemianism. He was a clergyman, and was going to do as other clergymen did, neither better nor worse. He greeted Ernest rather de haut en bas. That is to say, he began by trying to do so, but the affair tailed off unsatisfactorily. His sister presented her cheek to him to be kissed. How he hated it! He had been dreading it for the last 3 hours. She too was distant and reproachful in her manner, as such a superior person was sure to be. She had a grievance against him inasmuch as she was still unmarried. She laid the blame of this at Ernest's door. It was his misconduct, she maintained in secret, which had prevented young men from making offers to her, and she ran him up a heavy bill for consequential damages. She and Joey had from the first developed an instinct for hunting with the hounds, and now these two had fairly identified themselves with the older generation, that is to say, as against Ernest. On this head there was an offensive and defensive alliance between them, but between themselves there was subdued but internecine warfare. This at least was what Ernest gathered, partly from his recollections of the parties concerned, and partly from his observations of their little ways during the first half-hour after his arrival, while they were all together at his mother's bedroom, for as yet, of course, they did not know that he had money. He could see that they eyed him from time to time with a surprise not unmixed with indignation, and knew very well what they were thinking. Christina saw the change which had come over him, how much firmer and more vigorous both in mind and body he seemed than when she had last seen him. She saw, too, how well he was dressed, and, like the others, in spite of the return of all her affection for her firstborn, was a little alarmed about Theobald's pocket, which she supposed would have to be mulcted for all this magnificence. Perceiving this, Ernest relieved her mind and told her all about his aunt's bequest, and how I had husbanded it, in the presence of his brother and sister, who, however, pretended not to notice, or at any rate to notice as a matter in which they could hardly be expected to take an interest. His mother kicked a little at first against the money's having gone to him, as she said, over his papa's head. "Why, my dear," she said in a deprecating tone, "this is more than ever your papa has had." But Ernest calmed her by suggesting that if Miss Pontifex had known how large the sum would become, she would have left the greater part of it to Theobald. This compromise was accepted by Christina, who forthwith, ill as she was, entered with ardour into the new position, and taking it as a fresh point of departure, began spending Ernest's money for him. I may say in passing that Christina was right in saying that Theobald had never had so much money as his son was now possessed of. In the first place, he had not had a 14 years' minority, with no outgoings to prevent the accumulation of the money, and in the second, he, like myself and almost everyone else, had suffered somewhat in the 1846 times, not enough to cripple him or even seriously to hurt him, but enough to give him a scare and make him stick to debentures for the rest of his life. It was the fact of his son's being the richer man of the two, and of his being rich so young, which rankled with Theobald even more than the fact of his having money at all. If he had had to wait till he was 60 or 65, and become broken down from long failure in the meantime, why then he might have been allowed to have whatever sum should suffice to keep him out of the workhouse and pay his deathbed expenses. But that he should come into £70,000 at 28 and have no wife and only 2 children, it was intolerable. Christina was too ill and in too great a hurry to spend the money to care much about such details as the foregoing, and she was naturally much more good-natured than Theobald. This piece of good fortune, she saw it at a glance, quite wiped out the disgrace of his having been imprisoned. There should be no more nonsense about that. The whole thing was a mistake, an unfortunate mistake, true, but the less said about it now the better. Of course Ernest would come back and live at Battersby until he was married, and he would pay his father handsomely for board and lodging. In fact, it would be only right that Theobald should make a profit, nor would Ernest himself wish it to be other than a handsome one. This was far the best and simplest arrangement, and he could take his sister out more than Theobald or Joey cared to do, and would also doubtless entertain very handsomely at Battersby. Of course he would buy Joey a living, and make large presents yearly to his sister. Was there anything else? Oh, yes, he would become a county magnate now. A man with nearly £4,000 a year should certainly become a county magnate. He might even go into Parliament. He had very fair abilities, nothing indeed approaching such genius as Dr. Skinner's, nor even as Theobald's. Still, he was not deficient, and if he got into Parliament, so young too, there was nothing to hinder his being Prime Minister before he died, and if so, of course, he would become a peer. Oh, why did he not set about it all at once, so that she might live to hear people call her son my lord? Lord Battersby she thought would do very nicely, and if she was well enough to sit, he must certainly have her portrait painted at full length for one end of his large dining hall. It should be exhibited at the Royal Academy. Portrait of Lord Battersby's mother, she said to herself, and her heart fluttered with all its wonted vivacity. If she could not sit, happily she had been photographed not so very long ago, and the portrait had been as successful as any photograph could be of a face which depended so entirely upon its expression as her own. Perhaps the painter could take the portrait sufficiently from this. It was better after all that Ernest had given up the church. How far more wisely God arranges matters for us than ever we could do for ourselves. She saw it all now. It was Joey who would become the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Ernest would remain a layman and become Prime Minister, and so on, till her daughter told her it was time to take her medicine. I suppose this reverie, which is a mere fragment of what actually ran through Christina's brain, occupied about a minute and a half, but it, or the presence of her son, seemed to revive her spirits wonderfully. Ill, dying indeed, and suffering as she was, she brightened up so as to laugh once or twice quite merrily during the course of the afternoon. Next day Dr. Martin said she was so much better that he almost began to have hopes of her recovery again. Theobald, whenever this was touched upon as possible, would shake his head and say, "We can't wish it prolonged." And then Charlotte caught Ernest unawares and said, "You know, dear Ernest, that these ups and downs of talk are terribly agitating to Papa. He could stand whatever comes, but it is quite too wearing to him to think half a dozen different things backwards and forwards, up and down in the same 24 hours, and it would be kinder of you not to do it. I mean, not to say anything to him, even though Dr. Martin does hold out hopes." Charlotte had meant to imply that it was Ernest who was at the bottom of all the inconvenience felt by Theobald, herself, Joey, and everyone else, and she had actually got words out which